Continuing Jessie L. Weston's From Ritual to Romance. It's a 1920 book, but this printing is later than that, so that's why I'm not facing the book. In the same way, the advocate of a folklore origin is met with the objection that the section of the cycle for which such a source can be definitively proved, i.e., the Percival story, had originally nothing to do with the Grail, and that, while parallels can be found for this or that feature of the legend, such parallels are isolated in character and involve the breaking up of the tale into a composite of mutually independent themes, a prototype containing the main features of the Grail story, the wasteland, the Fisher King, the hidden castle with its solemn feast and mysterious feeding vessel. The bleeding lance and cup does not, so far as we know, exist. None of the great collections of folk tales, due to the industry of a Cosquin, a Heartland, or a Campbell, has preserved specimens of such a type. It is not such a story as, e.g., the 3 Days tournament, examples of which are found all over the world. Yet, neither the advocate of a Christian origin nor the folklorist can afford to ignore the arguments and evidence of the opposing school, and while the result of half a century of patient investigation has been to show that the origin of the Grail story must be sought elsewhere than in ecclesiastical legend or popular tale, I hold that the result has equally been to demonstrate that neither of these solutions should be ignored, but that the ultimate source must be sought for in a direction which shall do justice to what is sound in the claims of both. Some years ago, when fresh from the study of Sir J.G. Fraser's epic-making work, The Golden Bough, I was struck by the resemblance existing between certain features of the Grail story and characteristic details of the nature cults described. The more clearly I analyzed the tale, the more striking became the resemblance, and I finally asked myself whether it were not possible that in this mysterious legend, mysterious alike in its character, its sudden appearance, the importance apparently assigned to it, followed by as sudden and complete a disappearance, we might not have the confused record of a ritual once popular, later surviving under conditions of strict secrecy. This would fully account for the atmosphere of awe and reverence, which, even under distinctly non-Christian conditions, never fails to surround the Grail. It may act simply as a feeding vessel. It is nonetheless tout Sainte Causse. Tout Sainte Causse? And also for the presence in the tale of distinctly popular and folklore elements. Such an interpretation would also explain features irreconcilable with Orthodox Christianity, which had caused some scholars to postulate a heterodox origin for the legend, and thus explain its curiously complete disappearance as a literary theme. In the first volume of my Percival Studies, published in 1906, I hinted at this possible solution of the problem, a solution worked out more fully in a paper read before the Folklore Society in December of the same year and published in volume 18 of the Journal of the Society. By the time my second volume of studies was ready for publication in 1909, further evidence had come into my hands. I was then certain that I was upon the right path, and I felt justified in laying before the public the outlines of a theory of evolution, alike of the legend and of the literature, to the main principles of which I adhere today. But certain links were missing in the chain of evidence, and the work was not complete. No inconsiderable part of the information at my disposal depended on personal testimony, the testimony of those who knew of the continued existence of such a ritual and had actually been initiated into its mysteries. And for such evidence, the student of the letter has little respect. He worships the written word for the oral, living tradition from which the word derives force and vitality. He has little use. Therefore, the written word had to be found. It has taken me some 9 or 10 years longer to complete the evidence, but the chain is at last linked up, and we can now prove by printed text the parallels existing between each and every feature of the Grail story and the recorded symbolism of the mystery cults. And as far as oral tradition, it's interesting how in ancient India we have evidences of geological facts in the right period being passed on for a couple million years. Some stuff was passed on for 40,000 years or less. I mean, most stuff that is passed on is definitely in that period. Very little is outside of that, but kind of shows that we should be looking at the oral traditions of, countries that it goes back several thousand years before we have the written history. Further, we can show that between these mystery cults and Christianity, there extended at one time a close and intimate union, such a union as of itself involved the practical assimilation of the central rite in each a Eucharistic feast, in which the worshippers partook of the food of life from the sacred vessels, in face of the proofs which will be found in these pages. I do not think that any fair-minded critic will be inclined to dispute any longer the origin of the Holy Grail. After all, it is august and ancient in origin, as the most tenacious upholder of its Christian character could desire. But I should wish it clearly to be understood that the aim of these studies is, as indicated in the title, to determine the origin of the Grail, not to discuss the providence and interrelation of the different versions. I do not believe that this latter task can be satisfactorily achieved unless and until we are of one accord as to the character of the subject matter. When we have made up our minds as to what the Grail really was and what it stood for, we shall be able to analyze the romances, to decide which of them contains more, which less, of the original matter, and to group them accordingly. On this point, I believe that the table of descent, printed in volume 2 of my Percival studies, is in the main correct, but there is still much analytical work to be done. In particular, the establishment of the original form of Perlesvaus is highly desirable, but apart from the primary object of these studies and the result therein obtained, I would draw attention to the manner in which the evidence is set forth in the chapters on the mystery cults, and especially that of the Nicene document, a text of extraordinary value from more than one point of view, supports and complements the researches of Sir J. G. Fraser, I am, of course, familiar with the attacks directed against the vegetation theory, the sarcasms of which it has been the object, and the criticisms of what is held in some quarters to be the exaggerated importance attached to these nature cults. Well, I mean, what was in the grill? But in view of the use made of these cults as the medium of imparting high spiritual teaching, a use which in face of the document is above referred to, can no longer be ignored or evaded. Are we not rather justified in asking if the true importance of the rites has as yet been recognized? Can we possibly exaggerate their value as a factor in the evolution of religious consciousness? Such a development of his researches naturally lay outside the range of Sir J.G. Fraser's work, but posterity will probably decide that, like many another patient and honest worker, he builded better than he knew. I have carefully read Sir W. Ridgway's attack on the school in his dramas and dramatic dances, and while the above remarks explain my position with regard to the question as a whole, I would here take the opportunity of stating specifically my grounds for dissenting from certain of the conclusions at which the learned author arrives. I do not wish it to be said, this is all very well, but Miss Weston ignores the arguments on the other side. I do not ignore, but I do not admit their validity. It is perfectly obvious that Sir W. Ridgway's theory, reduced to abstract terms, would result in the conclusion that all religion is based upon the cult of the dead, and that men originally knew no gods but their grandfathers, a theory from which, as a student of religion, I absolutely and entirely dissent. I can understand that such dead ancestors can be looked upon as protectors or benefactors, but I see no ground for supposing that they have ever been regarded as creators. Yet, it is precisely as a vehicle for the most lofty teaching as to the cosmic relations existing between God and man that these vegetation cults were employed. The more closely one studies pre-Christian theology, the more strongly one is impressed with the deeply and daringly spiritual character of its speculations, and the more doubtful it appears that such teaching can depend upon the unaided process of human thought, or can have been evolved from such germs as we find among the supposedly primitive peoples, such as the Australian tribes. Are they really primitive? Are we really dealing not with primary elements of religion, but with the disjecta membra of a vanished civilization? Certainly, it is that, so far as historical evidence goes, our earliest records point to the recognition of a spiritual, not of a material origin, of the human race. The Sumerian and Babylonian psalms were not composed by men who believed themselves to be descendants of witchy grubs. The folk practices and ceremonies studied in these pages, the dances, the rough dramas, the local and seasonal celebrations, do not represent the material out of which the Attis-Adonis cult was formed, but surviving fragments of a worship from which the higher significance has vanished. Sir W. Ridgway is confident that Osiris, Attis, Adonis were all at one time human beings. Well, there's a lot of truth to that sort of thing occurring in the retelling, whose tragic fate gripped hold of popular imagination and led to their ultimate deification. The first named cult stands on a somewhat different basis from the other, the beneficent activities of Osiris being more widely diffused, more universal in their operation. I should be inclined to regard the Egyptian deity primarily as a cultural hero rather than a vegetation god. With regard to Attis and Adonis, whatever their original character, and it seems to me highly improbable there should have been two youths, each beloved by a goddess, each victim of a similar fate. Long before we have any trace of them both have become so intimately identified with the processes of nature that they have been ceased to be men and become gods. Well, certainly people were grafted into certain pre-existing themes. And as such alone can we deal with them. It is also permissible to point out that in the case of Tammuz, Esmun, and Adonis, the title is not a proper name, but a vague appellative, denoting an abstract rather than a concrete origin. Proof of this will be found later. Sir W. Ridgway overlooks the fact that it is not the tragic death of Attis Adonis which is of importance for these cults, but their subsequent restoration to life, a feature which cannot be postulated of any ordinary mortal. And how are we to regard Tammuz, the prototype of all these so-called deities? Is there any possible ground for maintaining that he was ever a man? Prove it we cannot, as the records of his cult go back thousands of years before our era. Here again we have the same dominant feature. It is not merely the untimely death which is lamented, but the restoration to life which is celebrated. Some of these we can trace to astrological reason, things that throughout the whole study, the author fails to discriminate between the activities of the living and the dead king. The dead king may, as I have said above, be regarded as the benefactor, as the protector of his people, but it is the living king among whom their actual and continued prosperity depends. The detail that the ruling sovereign is sometimes regarded as the reincarnation of the original founder of the race strengthens this point. The king never dies. Le roi est mort, vive le roi is very emphatically the motto of this faith. It is the insistence on life. Life continues, ever renewing, which is the abiding characteristic of these cults, a characteristic which differentiates them utterly and entirely from the ancestral worship with which Sir W. Ridgway could fain connect them. Nor are the arguments based upon the memorial rights of definitely historical heroes of comparatively later date, such as Hussein and Hossein, of any value here. Hassan and Hussein, yeah. It is precisely the death and not the resurrection of the martyr which is of the essence of Muharram. No one contends that Hussein rose from the dead, but it is precisely this point which is of primary importance in the nature cults, and Sir W. Ridgway must surely be aware that folklorists find in this very Muharram distinct traces of borrowing from earlier vegetation rites. The author triumphantly asserts that the fact that certain Burmese heroes and heroines are, after death, reverenced as tree spirits sets at rest forever the belief in abstract deities. But how can we be sure if the process was not the reverse of that which he postulates, i.e., that certain nature objects, trees, rivers, were not regarded as sacred before the Nats became connected with them? That the deified human beings were not after death assigned to places already held in reverence. Such a possibility is obvious to any folklore student, and local traditions should in any case be carefully examined before the contrary is definitely asserted. So far as the origins of drama are concerned, the ode quoted later from the Nicene document is absolute and definite proof of the close connection existing between the Attis mystery ritual and dramatic performances, i.e., Attis regarded in his deified creative logos aspect, not as Attis, the dead youth. And as my 2019 Yule ritual, the Ophin Logos is a prophetic role. I mean, it's the figure. It's not what the random attendees are capable of. It's something more so, and these figures often end up being worshipped by others. Nor do I think that the idea of mana can be lightly dismissed as an ordinary case of relics. The influence may well be something entirely apart from the continued existence of the ancestor, an independent force assisting him in life, and transferring itself after death to his successor. A magic sword or staff is not necessarily a relic. Medieval romance supplies numerous instances of self-acting weapons whose virtue in no wise depends upon their previous owner, as e.g. the sword in La Chevalier à l'Épée, or the flaming lance of the Chevalier de la Charrette. Doubtless, the cult of the ancestors played a large role in the beliefs of certain peoples, but it is not a significantly solid foundation to bear the weight of the superstructure. Sir W. Ridgway would fain rear upon it, while it differs too radically from the cults he attacks to be used as an argument against them. The one is based upon death, the other on life. Wherefore, in spite of all the learning and ingenuity brought to bear against it, I avow myself an impenitent believer in Sir J. G. Fraser's main theory. As I have said before, I hold that theory to be of greater and more far-reaching importance than has been hitherto suspected. And a fanaticism, remember the original definition of fanaticism, that you mistake the person or the temple as it. So someone comes to have the teaching, ends up being worshipped over time, but I would add a few words in the form of these studies. They may be found disconnected. They have been written at intervals of time extended over several years, and my aim has been to prove the essentially archaic character of all the elements composing the Grail story, rather than to analyze the story as a connected whole. With this aim in view, I have devoted chapters to features which have now either dropped out of the existing versions or survive in a subordinate form, e.g. the chapters on the Medicine Man and the Freeing of the Waters. The studies will, I hope and believe, be accepted as an offering of definitive contribution towards establishing the fundamental character of our material as stated above. When we are all at one as to what the Holy Grail really was and is, we can then proceed with some hope of success to criticize the manner in which different writers have handled the inspiring theme, but such success seems to be hopeless so long as we all start from different and often utterly irreconcilable standpoints and proceed along widely diverging roads. One or another may indeed arrive at the goal, but some unanimity of opinions will lend to our criticism such unanimity of opinions as will lend to our criticism authoritative weight is, on such lines, impossible of achievement. And just like Christianity is kind of not entirely even Mithraism, the Grail legends, okay, it may have a Celtic pre-Christian origin, but then again, it grafts on various myths, and it really wasn't of that. But when we think of our hero gods, or any other concept of God, can you think of something higher than Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim? Qul huwallahu ahad, Allahu samad, lam yalid wa lam yulad wa lam yakul lahu kufuwan ahad. In the name of God, the Beneficent, the Merciful. Say He, God in the singular and definitive, is one. God is the eternal, self-sufficient. He's not a parent, nor a child, and there's none like him in anything. And so, when you think of a deity, is this claim of a deity more exalted than that? Is there any, but certainly people personified certain aspects they were in awe of. But wouldn't you rather worship something like that?